Hi, welcome back to Mr. B's Math class. Today we're looking at 2.3 dividing decimal numbers. Our student outcomes for today are I can use estimation to place a decimal point in a quotient, and I can divide decimal numbers with and without a calculator. We have a couple key terms today to look at before we get started, and that's divisor, which is the number that the dividend is dividing by. So right here you can see this is our divisor because it's being divided by this, and dividend is the number that's being divided itself. So we're dividing 45 by 5. So when we look at our equation here, we got to remember the divisor is here and our dividend is here. But again, this is a review from last year, so we're just going to move on to the next little bit of a review. So the first quick little thing we're going to do today is just using estimation to place the decimal point. Well, we're going to do the same thing we've been doing each of the last two lessons in 2.1 and 2.2. We're just looking to see where in this number would the decimal fall. Now, I'm just going to look at it in the way of using kind of front-end estimation, where I say, okay, 15.4, I'm just going to keep it as 15. And dividing wise, I look at the number I have here, and while 3.6 definitely would round up to 4, I know that 15 divided by 4 is going to give me a decimal number. So I don't want that. I want something pretty easy. So I know 15 divided by 3 is going to give me 5. So I'm just going to estimate that they're both the whole numbers that will divide into one another. So with this answer here now, we know that the decimal is after one digit, which means that the decimal will go right there in our answer. So really when you're doing this in the assignments, it's just using your basic estimation skills. You can use the front-end estimation, you can use relative size, or you can just use the basic kind of thing that I did here, looking for the closest equation that will give me a whole number as an answer. So now let's just move on because this isn't what we're going to spend a lot of time on in this lesson. Now before we get into actually using decimals, I just want to briefly review what long division is, because you might have forgotten over the summertime. So if we're looking at our question here, 68 divided by 2, we need to change the way that it's written because we know that 2 is our divisor and 68 is our dividend. So if we're going to write this the proper way for long division, we're going to write 2 going into 68. So now 2 is my divisor and 68 is my dividend. Now in step 2, we need to check to see if the divisor goes into the first number in the dividend. So does 2 go into 6? Yes, it goes in 3 times. And that's exactly what step 3 is. It's just saying how many times does it go in? Well, we wrote it down. So 2 goes into 6 3 times. And now looking at step 4, we've got our 3 on top now. We just need to multiply by the divisor. So we have 3 times 2, as we already know, is 6, so we write it down here. And in step 5, we just subtract. So 6 minus 6 is 0. So we're good so far. Now we have to bring the next digit down. So we're going to bring our 8 down, which leads us to our next step. So in step 7, we're just repeating the process again that we just did. So we're going to ask ourselves, how many times does the divisor 2 go into 8? Because it's the next number down. So we know that 2 goes into 8 4 times. And then we need to multiply and subtract again. So that 4 here multiplied by the 2, we know gives us 8. And we subtract again, and we have 0. So now we're all done. We've used all the numbers. So 68 divided by 2, our answer is 34. So that's our little bit of review for long division. And again, I'm not going to do a lot of time on it because we've spent time in the past working on this. So now let's look at getting into decimals. So now we're going to look at actually dividing decimals using some long division. But before we get started, there are a couple rules we need to look at. So the first rule we're going to look at involves when we're dividing a decimal by a whole number. Okay? So let's say the example we could use maybe is 40.5 divided by 5. Which, as we know, is going to be written like this. So step 1, we need to forget about the decimal entirely, which means that when we write it, we're going to actually write it like this. 5 into 405. Step 2 just says to divide is normal. So dividing is normal from what we just reviewed. We look and ask ourselves, how many times does 5 go into 40? 5 goes into 40, so our number's here. 5 goes into 40 evenly, it actually goes in 8 times. Then we multiply and subtract, so 5 times 8 is 40. When we subtract 40 to subtract 40 gives us 0. Then we need to do the next step, which is bringing that other 5 down. We ask ourselves the same question. How many times does 5 go into 5? We know the answer to that is 1. We multiply again, so we multiply 1 by 5, which we know is going to give us 5, and we subtract. 5 subtract 5 is 0, and there we have our answer. Now the last step, it says calculate and move the decimal straight up. So we knew that in our question, our decimal was right there. So all we're going to do is bump it right up to there for an answer of 8.1. It was right there again, and we went straight up. So that's pretty much it. So it's just so you can remember to initially forget about the decimal and just long divide, and at the very end, move the decimal up where it belongs. Now let's look at the second rule we look at if we're dividing decimals. So in this situation, now we are looking at dividing a decimal by another decimal. So as you can see here, we have 0.4, so a decimal, dividing into 7.6. So it's a little bit different than what we're used to in the last rule. So step 1 just says to move the decimal in the divisor all the way to the right. So when we look here, our decimal's here, and it only takes us one jump to move it all the way to the right. So we can rewrite it as 0.4, or because 0.4 and 4 are the same, you can just write it as 4 because the decimal's not there anymore. And then when we write the next part in step 2, it says to move the decimal and the dividend over the same number of places. Well, we know we moved it over one spot, so we're going to move it again over one place. So our new number we have is 76. And then step 3 just says divide as normal. Now we have two whole numbers, so we do the exact same thing we did before in our review. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 4 go into 7? We know the answer is 1. Now we multiply and divide. 1 multiplied by 4, we know gives us 4, and we subtract. So 7 subtract 4 is 3. We then bring our next number down, which is 36, and we repeat the process. How many times does 4 go into 36? We know that answer is 9. Then we multiply and subtract again. So 9 multiplied by 4 we know is 36. And we subtract. 36 subtract 36 is 0, which gives us a nice, beautiful answer of 19. Now, if there was a decimal still here, you could move it up if you want to. That's the last step here, if that ever came up. So really, our answer is 19 or 19.0. They're both the same thing. But it's important to remember that if we saw the decimal in our answer here, all you do is just move it up like we did in the last one. Our next example is going to deal with a question that has that as a possibility. So let's take a look at it. So we're looking at 4.56 divided by 0.8. So if we have that, we rewrite it as 0.8 dividing into 4.56. Now we know from the last question that this actually is going to look a little different. We need to make sure that we're moving our decimal all the way to the right, which in this case is one jump, so it becomes 8. And we know that we have to move the decimal and the dividend the same number of places. So it moved once, so it'll also move once there, which gives us an answer of 45.6. Now we just do our division like we've done regularly. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 8 go into 45? Now we know 8 goes into 45, actually 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40, which we can then subtract, and we get an answer of 5. And now we're going to bring our next number down. So we're going to bring the 6 down and repeat the process. How many times does 8 go into 56? Well, we're quite lucky here because 8 goes into 56 7 times. We multiply and subtract. 7 times 8 is 56, which gives us an answer of 0. Now this is where it's so important, as I've highlighted here. If there's a decimal left in the dividend, which there is, we move it up in the answer. So right now we take this decimal and move it straight up and put it there. So our answer is 5.7. So that's really important that at the end, if you've still got that decimal in the dividend, you need to move it up. And we have the answer of that. So let's look at one or two more examples and then we're done for today. So let's look at 57.9 divided by 3. So a whole number and a decimal. So if you want, you can pause it here and then just hit play when you've tried it out and see if it matches up what we've got. Okay, so we know step 1, we need to rewrite this. So we got our divisor there, like this, and our dividend like this. Now we know in step 1, it said we needed to forget about the decimals. So 3, we rewrite it as 579, pardon me. So there are no decimals now. So we look at just dividing a basic long division question of 3 into 579. So step 1, we ask ourselves how many times does 3 go into the first number? 3 goes into 5 once. We multiply and subtract. So 1 times 3 is 3. We subtract and we get 2 and bring our next number down. We ask ourselves the same thing all over again. How many times does 3 go into 27? We know that that answer is 9. We multiply and subtract again. So 3 multiplied by 9 is actually 27. We subtract. 27 subtract 27 is 0. We bring this number back down again. And we ask ourselves, how many times does 3 go into 9? We know that answer is 3. So now we multiply and subtract again. 3 times 3 gives us an answer of 9. When we subtract, 0. And now all we have to do to finish up our step here is move that decimal straight back up again. So our decimal was right here. So we're going to move it right back up, and it becomes 19.3. So now let's look at our final example. So we have 5.24 divided by 0.5. So to make things easier, let's write it the proper way for long division. So we have 0.5 dividing into 5.24. Now, our next step, which is step 1, we need to make sure that we move the decimal all the way to the right for our divisor. So we know that that took one step, and now we get 5. And in step 2, we have to take this decimal in the dividend and move it the same number of places. And in this case, it was just one spot, so it becomes 5.2.4. Step 3 was just to divide as usual. So let's ask ourselves, how many times does 5 go into 52? Well, we know that answer is 10. 10 multiplied by 5 gives us 50, and we subtract. 52 subtract 50 is just 2. And then we're going to repeat what we always do. We're going to pull down the 4 here. And now we ask ourselves, how many times does 5 go into 24? Well, we know the answer to that question is 4 times. And then we multiply and subtract. 4 multiplied by 5, we know that's 20. We subtract it. 24 subtract 20 gives us an answer of 4. Now we ask ourselves again, repeat another time, how many times does 5 go into 4? Well, now we know that won't work because 5 doesn't go into 4. It's too big. And there's no numbers left over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to then help ourselves out. We don't have a remainder because we don't want a remainder. So all we're going to do is bring a 0 here just to give us a bigger number to work with. So now we ask ourselves, how many times does 5 go into 40? And the answer to that question is 8. We repeat the process again. 8 multiplied by 5 is 40. We subtract it and we get 0. And our final step now is to move that decimal straight up, which gives us 10.48 as our answer. So just remember that at the very end, you can't have a remainder. So you have to keep using these zeros and helping yourself get bigger numbers until you have nothing left. Now that's pretty much it for today, and I understand a bit of this might be a little confusing right now just because it's a review from maybe a year ago, but give it your best shot, and if you have any questions, let me know tomorrow.